Hello, this is Bronwyn Aly, Local Food Systems and Small Farms Educator for the University of Illinois. And for this week's Local Food Happenings at Dixon Springs Ag Center, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about physiological disorders on tomatoes and how that can affect our fruit quality. And so later, the remainder of this video will be looking at some examples of different physiological disorders, whether it be zippering or misshapen fruit, uneven ripening, and cracking. We're going to look at examples of those and kind of show you why we need to try to help mitigate those issues if at all possible, as it affects the number of fruit that we can count as marketable and get sold to our customers for a good market price. As we move through a tomato harvest season, while we would like to see every tomato in our patch look like the tomato in the very front part of your screen, we don't always get those tomatoes, and we have some physiological disorders that can be caused either from environmental issues or fertility issues, nutrient issues, and while these are not disease related, they do cause us to have to cull out our tomato fruit. Some of these may very well make excellent canners for that type of market, but if you're selling into a grocery store or a market that is requiring you to have US #1 grade fruit, as you can see, the tomatoes on past this first one would not make that USA grade #1 fruit quality cut. And so again, the tomato in the front would be something that we would like to see ideally. And so as I talk about some of these physiological disorders, I wanted to start with things that we might see early in the season that can be issues during either pollination or right at the early formation of young fruit. And so the two tomatoes right behind the first one, this yellow one and the one beside it, we can see that they both have an issue that we call zippering. And with zippering, that is occurs right after pollination, and it may be caused by a piece of the flower that may be touching or laying on that very young fruit. And as that fruit is starting to form, that contact with that foreign object creates that zipper line. And so we see zippering, and zippering is basically just on the outside of the skin. It's not going to be deep into the tissue of the fruit itself. And as we move further back into the next row, we see a more severe case of zippering, in which we almost have an open locule here. We see scarring in that, and that's definitely going to be considered a cull fruit. And if we were to cut that fruit, we would see that there is some tissue damage further in besides just cosmetically on the skin. So I'll just go ahead and cut this one so we can see what that looks like on the inside. And so it's not causing this fruit to rot, but it is not just on the skin, it is down into some of that flesh as well. And so that, again, is another physiological disorder occurring either at pollination or right at the beginning of fruit set. And the next two back are just severely misshapen fruit. This one is extremely severe. And again, this is just an issue at pollination. Maybe it's it was too hot or potentially too humid, maybe even too cool. The temperature conditions, weather conditions were just not exactly perfect at the timing when this fruit was pollinated, and so it creates that issue. And then the very back fruit that we wanted to look at, I've been seeing a lot of this actually this season on several different varieties, is some scarring on the blossom end. It almost reminds me of the zippering in how it looks, and it's just superficial on the skin. So I believe again that was something that was occurring either at pollination or right after pollination, maybe even that is on the blossom end, so maybe the blossom was hanging on the fruit just a little bit longer and created some disruption in the formation of the fruit and caused that scarring. But again, these would all make fine canners. There's nothing wrong with it. They're not rotting. They're just a little bit misshapen and would not be considered a U.S. grade #1 fruit. The next physiological disorder I wanted to share with you is cracking. This is a very common problem. We see this later in fruit development, more at the time of onset of coloring. As the fruit are starting to color and ripen, we see more incidents of cracking. We can attribute cracking to water management issues, whether the soil has gotten too dry and then receives a large amount of rain, or if it's just seeing fluctuations in that water moisture and the uptake of the plant. It's not necessarily, it doesn't always have to be how much moisture may or may not be in the soil. You'd also see this if we had a plant that we pruned quite a bit of foliage or leaf material off, and then all of a sudden the plant is drawing more water up and it's being dispersed into the fruit more than it had been when those leaves were still on, and then that fruit can tend to swell. The skin doesn't, and the fruit don't grow as fast as the water, and it literally swells and splits. And a really good example of that would be on this tomato. It was when it was harvested, it was pretty close to ripe. I wouldn't call it dead ripe, but it was probably in the orange-red category. But as you can see, the skin just split open. And you can also notice that this is a very new split because we're not seeing any rot or blackening in this crack compared to these that are a little bit older, and we're starting to see them scar up and see a little bit of darkening in there. Again, this is a fairly new crack. Also on this tomato, we have what we call concentric cracking, which are cracks in circles around the stem. And we can see concentric cracking as opposed to these two tomatoes that have the radial cracking. And again, these tomatoes would be considered culls with cracks this deep, radial cracks this deep. And the fact that there are multiple cracks on this tomato, it would have to go as a cull. I couldn't even really count this as a number 2. And obviously this one is split, so this would have to be a cull. Again, these two could be put in your, be sold for canners. They're not, these cracks have kind of sealed up and they're not open and oozing. This one that's still pretty fresh, if it's oozing at all, we're not going to want to put that even in our canner box. We're going to need to pitch that. And so managing our plant structure as well as our water can be very essential, because this otherwise perfectly good USA grade #1 grade tomato now has to go to the cull pile because we got too much water in it and it blew up. Another way something else to help avoid cracking, we do see varieties that are more susceptible to cracking than others, and so you can also try to select varieties that have less cracking potential than others. These next two fruit, a very, very common disorder that we see, and a lot of times could be mistaken as a disease, but actually this is what blossom end rot looks like on tomatoes. And we see blossom end rot where the blossom end of the fruit has not received enough calcium to fully develop that fruit, and so it starts to have the sunken areas at the base of the fruit. And while this is a lack of calcium in the fruit, a lot of times blossom end rot is more of a water management problem, and it may not necessarily mean that you don't have enough calcium in your soil, or in your fertigation that you're adding to your plants, it could just be that the amount of water and the plant's uptake of that water is not consistent and uniform, and the calcium was not able to be delivered to all of the areas in the fruit that it needed to completely form the fruit. And again, this can be not a disease. This is a physiological disorder. Besides management, this can also have some impacts based on our environmental conditions, because our temperature and our various environmental factors very much influence how the plant is taking up water and nutrients throughout the day, and so, or over a course of a period. And so we base this blossom end rot in we put that in as a physiological disorder with multiple causes. And this last physiological disorder that I want to talk about is uneven ripening and also Sunscald. We'll kind of fold those two in together. So with uneven ripening, again, a physiological disorder, and this can be a little bit of environment-based, temperature-based, but we also see this a lot with the lack of nutrients, specifically potassium. And when we're not getting enough potassium into the fruit, we will see this uneven ripening occur. And the other thing that we may see, what we call Sunscald, and this may be hard to see, but we have uneven ripening, but we also have a change in the texture of the flesh on the tomato. If we touch it, it may be a little bit rough and maybe thinning, and sometimes it can even go almost white from the exposure to the sun. And that can be maybe you have a plant that doesn't have enough foliar coverage to block out some of the sun. You get a lot of intense sunlight on your fruit without the shading of the leaves, and we can see this Sunscald occur. I think this season in particular in our high tunnel, I'm seeing a lot of uneven ripening and some Sunscald, and so this can be an issue to look at. And these fruit are not going to, they won't ever completely ripen. If we look at this fruit back here, it's pretty red, but when we turn it over, we can see these areas where it was never going to ripen. That's a little bit of a Sunscald and some uneven ripening. That's always going to stay yellow. If we cut this one, we cut that, we see we have a white core. Again, that's a sign that we didn't quite get enough nutrients in there, that our potassium might be lacking. This also could be varietal. Some varieties are more susceptible to the white coring than others. But as we see this, this area here, this tissue is won't ever completely ripen to red. And we could also cut another one of these to kind of look at what this one's looking like inside. And we see with that uneven ripening, as we look here, we see it all through the wall here. That tissue it won't ripen, and that's not going to make for a very good quality fruit. Whereas you see on this one side where we do have good ripening, we don't see any yellowing. We have good red flesh here. So I think that is what I wanted to talk about as far as physiological disorders. while we were discussing physiological disorders and problems with our fruit quality that would cause us to not be able to sell some fruit that would not make marketable grade, I also wanted to just show you some insect damage on the tomato fruit that could also create some marketing issues. If we look at the tomato on the right, we see some feeding from worm damage. And so not only did the worm feed on the outside of the flesh, but it also started burrowing in here. Not sure if this would have been tomato hornworm. Typically we don't see tomato fruit worm make this type of damage. They typically want to chew around in the stem area and kind of will bore in a little bit, maybe a little bit like that, but a lot of times we see it more in right around the stem. I did not see the worm beside this fruit when we harvested it, so I can't make a positive identification, but I do know that that is definitely damage from some type of worm feeding on this fruit. And obviously this is not going to be marketable. This other fruit, if you can see the bronzing and kind of the goldish speckling on the fruit, this is all damage from thrips feeding. And this is different than stink bug damage. I've been very fortunate this year we have not had stink bugs feeding on our fruit in the high tunnel this year. Otherwise I would have shown you an example of that. But with stink bug damage, it'll be a bright yellow, and you'll see some stippling, and there'll be lots of little areas of bright yellow indentions. With the thrips feeding this, you don't feel any change in the surface of the fruit. It's more just a discoloration, this gold flecking. Sometimes it makes almost semicircular patterns here. But if we were to cut this open, if we cut this, there's nothing past the skin surface. And so this may, look a little different than, say, this fruit, where we don't see any of the speckling or the flecking on it. But this shouldn't take away from the marketing. I don't know that I would count this as a US #1, but it would definitely be a #2. And we should still be able to sell this fruit and no problem. Except that we do have a little bit of a white core, and we may have some customers complain about some of that. If we cut this, we can see, yeah. So we do want to try to keep an eye on our fruit quality, and if we're having some type of physiological issues going on with it that's can be managed through changing our fertility program, we need to be aware of that, and be just like we scout our crops for insects and potential disease, we also need to be scouting our fruit and looking at quality of our fruit, so that if we need to make some adjustments in our fertility program, we can do that. We are not going to be able to control temperature or environmental conditions, so we need to be able to look at the things that we can control and try to manage those as best we can.